Hello my friends, my name is Hesam and I have a master's degree in English literature. In this channel, I try to share with you what I have learned from different pieces of literature. Today, I want to share with you the summary of Jane Eyre, a novel by Charlotte Brontë. Today, I want to talk about Jane Eyre. This novel was originally published under the title Jane Eyre, an Autobiography. This is a novel by English writer Charlotte Brontë. It was published under her gender-neutral pen name, Currer Bell, on October 19, 1847 by Smith, Elder and Company of London. Harper and Brothers of New York published the first American edition the following year. Jane Eyre is a Bildungsroman or coming-of-age novel that follows the experiences of its eponymous heroine, including her growth to adulthood and her love for Mr. Rochester, the brooding master of Thornfield Hall. In the beginning of the novel, Jane is a 10-year-old girl who lives in Gateshead Hall, home to the rich Reed family. Late Mr. Reed, Jane's maternal uncle, adopted her when she became orphaned at a young age. However, after his death, Mrs. Reed and her son John treated her like a servant. The only source of kindness in Jane's life comes from Mrs. Reed's house servant, Bessie Lee. Bessie reads her tales and realizes that Jane is a sharp child and treats her kindly. One day, when Jane was reading a book, John comes in and grabs the book and hits her with it. She had enough of these insults and she likens him to tyrants. He grabs her and finally Jane loses it. Mrs. Reed sees this and banishes her to the Red Room. The Red Room is one of the most majestic rooms of the mansion, though it is not inhabited by anyone. The reason for that was the fact that Mr. Reed took his last breath there. Thereby, because of superstitions or simply being a reminder of that sad event, it was left uninhabited. Here, Jane questions herself. Was she wicked as others claim that she was? She wonders if Mr. Reed's ghost will come to punish her as well. At this moment, she mistakes a flash of light, possibly the light of a lantern in someone's hand while they're passing, as the ghost that is attacking her. Her cries for help are not met by mercy, and she realizes that she must be imprisoned an hour longer there. It is at this moment that she falls unconscious because she is terrified. When she wakes up, she is on her bed and beside Bessie, Mr. Lloyd, an apothecary, is there too. She is relieved that someone other than Reed's family and their servant is there with her. Mr. Lloyd questions Jane, and after this, he talks to Mrs. Reed and tries to convince her to send Jane to a school. Jane preferred to live with Reeds in pain rather than to live in poverty, but the thought of going to school eluded her. After months of waiting, a gentleman named Mr. Brocklehurst visits her and starts to question her on religious grounds. It turns out that he is the magistrate of Lowood School, which was going to be her next home. Jane moves to Lowood School and she's fascinated by Maria Temple, the superintendent of Lowood School. She slowly tries to familiarize herself with her poor living conditions there. After a while, Jane befriends Helen Burns. She observes that when the teachers treat her harshly, she doesn't fight back, which she is baffled by. Jane does not agree with Helen's submission to the teacher's rule. Jane says, "But I feel this, Helen. I must dislike those who, whatever I do to please them, persist in disliking me. I must resist those who punish me unjustly. It is as natural as that I should love those who show me affection, or submit to punishment when I feel it is deserved." To which Helen asserts, "Heathens and savage tribes hold that doctrine, but Christians and civilized nations disown it." To Jane's dismay, Mr. Brocklehurst visits Lowood one day and he lectures the superintendent about the importance of raising the girls to be patient and pious. He claims that if their flesh is fully fed, then their souls will diminish. Well, of course, Mr. Brocklehurst is a hypocritical clergyman. While he talks about the importance of living as simply as possible, he dresses in fancy clothes and lives in a hall. His wife and daughters are wearing luxurious attires as if they don't reside under the jurisdiction of his God. Mr. Brocklehurst, the owner of the Lowood Institute, commands Jane to be put on a stool and be marked as a liar. He commands teachers and students to alienate her and shun her. Jane's spirit is initially crushed when she says to Helen, "I know I should think well of myself, but that is not enough. If others don't love me, I would rather die than live. I cannot bear to be solitary and hated, Helen. Look here, to gain some real affection from you, or Miss Temple, or any other whom I truly love, I would willingly submit to have the bone of my arm broken, or to let a bull toss me, or to stand behind a kicking horse and let it dash its hoofs at my chest." After this incident, however, Mrs. Temple talks to Jane and after learning about her sad past and what has transpired between her and Mrs. Reed, embraces her and befriends her. Then after questioning Mr. Lloyd about the authenticity of her account, she exonerates her from all charges in front of everyone. While everything seems to take a sweet turn, the typhus outbreak hits Lowood. While the healthy minority of girls enjoyed the increasing portions of meals, many of them died of disease. In the meantime, Helen passes away from consumption or tuberculosis. Jane tells us that even 15 years after her death, her grave didn't even have a marker stone. But presumably, Jane funds and makes a stone inscribed with her name and the phrase "Resurgam," meaning "I shall rise again." After these events, she studies for 6 more years and then teaches for 2 years after that at Lowood School. When Mrs. Temple marries and leaves the school, Jane has no reason left to stay there and applies for a job somewhere else. After a while, a lady named Alice Fairfax invites her to assume the post of governess at Thornfield Hall. She then realizes that although Miss Fairfax is related to the owner of the mansion, she is the housekeeper, and Thornfield belongs to Mr. Rochester. She then realizes that she is hired to tutor a girl named Adele. The reader of the novel might be baffled with Jane's progressive beliefs. She says, women are supposed to be very calm generally, but women feel just as men feel. They need exercise for their faculties and a field for their efforts as much as their brothers do. They suffer from too rigid a resistance, too absolute a stagnation, precisely as men would suffer, and it is narrow-minded in their more privileged fellow creatures to say that they ought to confine themselves to making puddings and knitting stockings, to play on the piano and embroidering bags. It is thoughtless to condemn them or laugh at them if they seek to do more or learn more than custom has pronounced necessary for their sex. One day, Jane sits to the nearby town to post a letter, when a horse rider moves past her and falls to the ground. She helps him to mount his horse but doesn't know who he is. It turns out that he is the owner of the mansion and her boss, Mr. Edward Rochester, who is 20 years older than Jane. Rochester reveals to Jane that he had a French lover, Celine, who was an opera dancer and she cheated on him. And Adele is perhaps his illegitimate daughter. However, Rochester himself doesn't believe that she is his offspring, since she doesn't look like him. Jane assures him that these confessions will not deter her from teaching Adele. She also gathers that Mr. Rochester wants to marry a rich lady named Blanche Ingram. One day, when she was going to bed, she heard a voice outside her door. She heard the source ascending to the 3rd floor. She goes outside to investigate and wants to inquire Miss Fairfax about the incident, but she smells smoke coming from Mr. Rochester's room. The curtains of his bed were on fire. By waking him up and trying to put off the fire, she rescues him. He affirmed Miss Fairfax's account in saying that laughter and the attempt on his life were done by one of the servants, Grace Poole. The next morning, she realizes that Mr. Rochester told the servants that he left the candle burning and fell asleep. This is why the bed caught fire and then he quenched the fire himself. The fact that Jane sees Grace next morning and she does not fear her and even acts as if nothing had happened makes her wonder why Mr. Rochester didn't at least fire her. Was he in love with her and she saw it fit to control him by such pranks? She thought. She notices that there is a discourse about Grace and what she does amongst the servants, which they exclude Jane from knowing it. On another occasion, a gentleman named Mason visits Mr. Rochester. In the middle of the night, a scream and call for help awakened everyone. Mr. Rochester, after reassuring everyone that it was one of the servants and that had a nightmare, calls Jane for help. Jane follows him to the room atop her own, where earlier she heard the call for help and sees Mr. Mason bleeding unconscious. Mr. Rochester goes to fetch a surgeon in secrecy, and Jane has to attend Mason's wound. Again, the day after that, he does not fire Grace, and this agitates her. Jane slowly falls in love with Mr. Rochester, but represses her impulses and imagines what sort of ladies he must fancy. Amid these feelings, one day Robert, Bessie's husband, visits Jane and tells her that John Reed is dead. She learns that he was in the company of terrible people, and he ruined his future and his family's fortune, and one day, perhaps, committed suicide. Jane asks Mr. Rochester for a week or two leave of absence. She first reasons with her not to go, but then agrees, and after that she travels to Gateshead. She finally arrives at her destination and meets Mrs. Reed. Her mind is slowly disintegrating, and she cannot recall why she asked for Jane's presence. But in her maddened speech, she reveals that she hated Jane because she reminded her of her mom. Late Mr. Reed loved her sister, and this made Mrs. Reed jealous. Jane is compelled to stay in Gateshead for a while, and she amuses herself by painting. One important aspect of her painting is that she uses her imagination to paint. This is in opposition to painting what one might perceive and paint. For example, Alfred Tennyson's Lady of Shalott is copying what she sees in the mirror. However, Jane imagines and paints, which gives her works originality. If we say that copying images from the mirror is like accepting the ideologies of the society, here Jane is not accepting the ideologies, she is imagining and she is creating. Mrs. Reed then tells Jane about a man called Jane Eyre who visited Gateshead one day and wanted to adopt his relative Jane. But since he was rich and Mrs. Reed didn't want Jane to prosper, never revealed this fact. She also tells Jane about how she felt when Jane told her how much she hated her. I could not forget my own sensations when you thus started up and poured out the venom of your mind. I felt fear as an animal that I had struck or pushed had looked up at me with human eyes and cursed me in a man's voice. You should know that Jane's voice was like a man's voice, since in Victorian era women are not allowed to be frank and speak their thoughts. Thereby, Mrs. Reed took revenge for Jane's actions by writing to her uncle who wanted to adopt her that she was dead of typhus in Lowood School. After Mrs. Reed's funeral, Jane stays a while there to help her cousins with trivial tasks, and then she returns to Thornfield. Jane is in love with Mr. Rochester but never tells him. In the meantime, he talks about his plans to marry Miss Ingram, but there is no indication of a ceremony nor visitations between the so-called lovers. One night, Mr. Rochester asks for Jane's hand in marriage, and they both rejoice. It turns out that Mr. Rochester started a rumor that he was not as rich as it seemed, and this was answered by Miss Ingram and her mom's cold reactions. He knew that she wasn't a good match, but now he was sure of it. He loves Jane, and since she loved him back, he decided to marry her. Before the wedding ceremony, Jane has a nightmare, but when she wakes, she sees a woman in a white garments who looks like a vampire that is examining her wedding veil. She then tears the veil, and on her way out, examines Jane's face under a candlelight, and she faints from fear. Jane recants this event only to Mr. Rochester, and he assures her that it was again Grace who did this. But Jane believes that it wasn't anyone that she knew and seen before. Mr. Rochester finally promises Jane to explain to her why he keeps Grace at Thornfield 1 year after their marriage. The day of the wedding finally comes. Just when the priest is going to ask each of them if they accept the other, a man named Mr. Briggs stops the ceremony and informs him that Mr. Rochester is a married man. His evidence shows that he was married 15 years ago. His documents are signed by Mr. Richard Mason. Mr. Rochester at first intended to deny everything, but when Mr. Mason entered as a witness, he confessed to everything. He was married to Bertha Mason 15 years ago, but she became mad like her mother. Then he invites everyone to follow him and see her for themselves. They saw someone that was growling like an animal and walking on fours. He asks everyone if he has to be judged. Mr. Rochester then explained that his father wanted his fortune to go to his brother, and he managed a wedding between him and his friend's Creole daughter. Mr. Mason was a rich planter in Jamaica, and Bertha was going to inherit £30,000 from her dad. Mr. Rochester's father and brother, knowing about her mad mother, married him to her simply for the money. Jane listened to Mr. Rochester's begging for love and forgiveness, but didn't agree to stay. The next day before sunrise, she left Thornfield without anyone noticing. Since she didn't have enough money, she spent nights outside, even succumbing to hunger and asking people for jobs. But people were not willing to help her. One day in a heavy rain, she finds the courage to go towards a distant light. She finds a house and knocks at the door. At first, they don't let her in, but after the house's master's arrival, they let her in. In this house lived Diana and Mary River, and their servant Hannah, and St. John, their brother, who was a parson, visited them from time to time. Sometime after this, St. John finds a job as a school teacher for Jane in the village. Later on, it is revealed that Jane's uncle has passed away, and she is his heir. She is rich now, and not only that, she realizes that her uncle John Eyre is River's maternal uncle as well. St. John proposes to Jane. He does not love her, but he wants them to travel to India to preach and spread the word of God. As a sister, she might do this, but as a wife, she cannot marry someone who never loved her. In the meantime, her letters to Thornfield are not answered, and she grows weary. Then one day, she decides to go there and see for herself what has happened to Mr. Rochester. She finds the house in ruins. Apparently, Bertha burned Jane's room and the fire spread. And then she went to the roof and jumped down. Mr. Rochester lost his left hand and one of his eyes, and his other eye lost its sight. She finds Mr. Rochester at Manor House, and after a short while marries him. Jane also arranges for Adele to be moved to a school near their house, so they can bring her home and visit her. 2 years after their marriage, Mr. Rochester recovers part of his sight, and they have a son. We learn that Jane's cousins are happily married too. St. John leaves England and goes to India to do his mission and never marries. It should be added that we have the mention of Bluebeard and Gytrash from the folklore in this novel as well. Bluebeard is a French folktale that tells the story of a wealthy man in the habit of murdering his wives. On the other hand, the guy trash was legendary shape-changer that was said to haunt lonely roads awaiting travelers, appearing usually in the shape of an animal like horses, mules, or dogs among the others. The guy trash haunt solitary ways and lead people astray. But they can also be benevolent, guiding lost travelers to the right road. This novel baffles me since it mentions Prophet Muhammad and also Medes and Persians from Rochester's mouth, which in turn shows us that in the Victorian era, an author like Charlotte Brontë was familiar with Middle Eastern culture and history. And when I say Middle Eastern history, I don't just mean the history related to the Bible, but you also should keep in mind that here in this novel we have the racist overtones as well. The crazy woman in the novel is a Creole, half white, half black. And also, Jane and other characters are talking about the civilization, the civilized way that they live in. English people have the better education. English people are civilized, and to some extent we can say that European people are civilized too. But other people in their mind are savages. These are points in novel which I believe that need scholarly attention. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I hope you found it useful. I wish you the best, and until the next video, farewell my friends.